Hi there, my name is Peter Murphy from the Sydney Politics in the Pub Committee. Welcome to this webcast, our first online event. I want to first of all acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm sitting today, and pay respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge all those First Nations around Australia where viewers are. Okay, tonight's topic is Australia in global recession. Is there a democratic path to recovery? Back in early March, Politics in the Pub debated the prospect of recession following the very weak economic performance and especially wage stagnation of the last 5 years, and then the impact of the bushfire crisis and the beginnings of the pandemic. The message from our speakers that night, Raja Junanka and Robin Fortescue, was that yes, there was going to be an economic crash, high unemployment, and a sustained attack on living standards and workers' rights through austerity and deregulation. So now it's August, 5 months later, and the picture is just so much worse. What should working people, democratic and progressive people, do in the face of this prospect? We've really got two great speakers tonight, Dan Nahum and Frank Stilwell, to lead this discussion. So I'll introduce them and then talk through just the procedure a little bit. So Dan is an economist with the Centre for Future Work of the Australia Institute. His research interests include industrial transformation, labour markets in low carbon economies, government finances, and inequity and inequality. Before joining the Centre for Future Work, he held roles in the Australian government in various social and economic policy fields, including Indigenous Affairs and the Office for Women, and was also a union delegate with the Community and Public Sector Union. He holds a Masters of Political Economy with the University of Sydney, where he focused on the moral dimensions of climate change, and an honours degree from Macquarie University, and he's an active musician. Frank Stilwell is now the Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. Frank is a well-known critic of conventional economics and an advocate of alternative economic strategies which prioritise social justice and economic sustainability. He has taught for over 40 years at the university and twice was awarded the university's Award for Excellence in Teaching. His research interests centre on Australian economic policies, urban and regional development, and economic inequality. He's the author of 12 books and is on the editorial board of the Journal of Australian Political Economy. So Dan and Frank are each going to speak for 20 minutes or so, and then we will move to the question and answer session through to our 8:15 finish time. We can finish early if we run out of questions, but we'll definitely finish then. Because we are online, questions and comments need to be forwarded to us through the comments facility on the YouTube site. So I think that you should switch to YouTube if you're not there yet, and use the comments there to process any question or comment through to us, and I'll have to read them out at the appropriate time. So please bear with this process, which is the first time we've had to work with this way. So now I'd like to welcome Dan Nahum to open up this important conversation. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thanks for the kind welcome. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra. I'm grateful to have lived most of my life here, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So I've been with the Centre for Future Work for about 8 months now, and before that I worked in the Commonwealth for 15 years or so, primarily at the interface of social and economic policy. And as Peter's mentioned, during that time I did complete a Masters in Political Economy at Sydney University, so to share this platform with Frank Stilwell is humbling indeed. So we've been asked to speak tonight about the topic, Australia in global recession. Is there a democratic pathway to recovery? And that's a huge topic. I think it becomes a little easier to grapple with if we are able to keep front of mind what the economy is for. And despite the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic and the economic crisis, I still don't think we as a polity are wrestling enough with that question. So what the role of the state in the economy is, how to distinguish good growth from plain old growth. And despite the events of the last few months, it's still the case that too often the economy is considered a force and a purpose unto itself. But the Overton window, if you believe in such a thing, is wide open right now. So I'd invite us all to climb through it. If asked about the economic purpose, those among us who are interested in the works of scholars such as of economics with an anthropological or historical view, such as Michael Hudson or David Graeber, for instance, might shoot back this well-rehearsed answer: social provisioning. So let's suppose, for argument's sake, that answer is accepted. We've got a term for what we're trying to achieve. And let's have a think about what social provisioning might mean. At a high level, it might include things like food and shelter, education, maybe vocational education, health resourcing, including mental health resourcing, all very important right now, leadership and reassurance, and that plays an important symbolic role as well as a functional one, and recreation, storytelling and entertainment. We need to make meaning of our social context. And a lot of what I've just described might be considered the foundational economy. And what I mean by that is the work and economic activity we fall back on, rely on under conditions of crisis. Care, sustenance, social reproduction. Now let's have a think about what a better economy than the one we had pre-COVID would entail. I think that what we're trying to do at a minimum is to tie industrial policy to energy policy, to a policy of full employment in the context of an ageing population. So to do that, we'd wean ourselves off polluting processes and we'd improve social equity. We'd use the dividend of our common wealth to drive a care economy, care for each other and care for the earth. And to do that, we'd need to understand living standards in broader terms than just GDP growth. Now, the private sector isn't going to figure that one out. It demands significant state coordination and public entrepreneurship. So with those sorts of criteria in mind, there's a few angles to democratic recovery which I'd like to consider. Firstly, the reinvigorated battle between, in simplistic terms, the pro-regulatory or welfare statist and the anti-regulatory or Austerian shock doctrine-oriented parts of our polity. And I'm reminded here of Karl Polanyi: democracy should discipline markets, not vice versa. And secondly, what would democracy look like in the workplace, and what would workers' democracy look like when those workers are excluded from the workplace? What sorts of jobs do we need, societally speaking, and what sorts of features do good jobs have? In a recession, as soon as we start to think a bit about the democratic future of work, we have to think about the features of non-work as well. COVID's demonstrated that. If you can't find work because we've deliberately and prudently shut down large sections of the economy, how do you keep participating in society? What does your re-entry into the workforce look like? Among other things, we've learned that 1, we needed an industry plan, and 2, we didn't really have one. So what would a good industry plan look like? Well, it would be fundamentally democratic in its orientation. I find it a source of continuing fascination and frustration that many of us consider our democratic right and duty to be discharged once we've visited a polling booth every few years. Now, obviously, this is a sliding scale. It's a luxury to have the time and space in your life to get into the nitty-gritty of, say, Senate inquiries and writing submissions and so on. But I'd suggest that you could do a lot worse than join your union, who at least have people who are tasked with doing that stuff on your behalf. It's notable that there has been an uptick in union membership since the COVID crisis began. And I'd invite everyone to have a bit of a think about whether that means that people are being exposed to unions for the first time, or whether they're remembering what they're for. Additionally, workers carving out the space to express a voice at work is key to the notion of a democratic workplace. Workplaces that might have representation baked in, such as workers' co-ops, are an underexplored model in Australia. In marked contrast, the makeup of the National COVID Coordination Commission, or NCCC, concerns me very much. One wonders whether this top-down, technocratic, oligarchic response to the crisis is because the people who govern us, the people who appointed the commissioners, can't imagine everyday democracy, or whether they don't want it. I happen to think the answer is both. Therefore, I think the real question is one of power. This sort of Pandora's box of democratic possibility has been opened inadvertently by the crisis, and our neoliberal political class is desperately trying to shove all that possibility back into it. I mean, what if people could just walk away from bad, meaningless, exploitative, dangerous, or unreasonable work and still be sure their material needs would be looked after? That would radically tip the scales of power back in favour of workers. And what if we all knew that any attempt to tip those scales away from us represented a political choice, rather than the Thatcheresque assertion, there is no alternative? Now, the politics of deficit phobia, and I say politics, not economics, has been a straitjacket on our policy horizons and on democratic debate and decision-making about the sort of economy that we want. Regarding the essence of government surpluses, as our chief economist, Dr. Richard Dennis, says, it's astonishing that "we'll tax you more than we'll spend on you" is a persuasive conservative election promise. This traditional infatuation with balancing the budget as opposed to the economy has left our political culture and discourse badly prepared to deal with what we need now: a sustained commitment to reconstruction requiring large deficits for years to come. I'm advised by economists I respect that deficit hysteria is the fault of the media and the professional political class, and in fact there is a swathe of mainstream macroeconomic literature that correctly identifies the nature of government debt and fiscal constraints. I am yet to encounter it. And it's disappointing to see that Australia's centre-left opposition attempting to outflank the government from the right on so-called economic management. Centrists like the Grattan Institute and Laura Tingle in the Australian Financial Review identify a huge funding shortfall in terms of what is needed to keep the economy on track versus what the government have committed to. Grattan talks about a $15 to $45 billion shortfall this year and a $35 to $45 billion shortfall next year. And the ALP are yet to endorse that analysis expressed by, I remind you, the sensible centre. Now, I understand that it must be tempting to kick the Conservatives for breaking their promises on debt, having endured troglodytic attacks along the same lines. But that's exactly it. Such attacks are still troglodytic and illiterate, no matter who was making them. There's no democratic space being carved out on the left by posturing as right-wingers. Australia is going to experience protracted government deficits, regardless of who's in charge, and a damn good thing too. Relatedly, on the capacity of the state to finance itself, I don't have a lot of time for so-called sound finance socialists who argue in favour of what they believe to be traditional Keynesianism at the expense of a conception of endogenous government finance, because at the moment we already have the right-wing iteration of modern monetary theory that these critics on the left warn us of. Endogenous government financing for the purposes of tax cuts, subsidising fossil fuels, buying war toys, rewarding mates, bailing out banks, and so on. Look what's actually happened to government debt since the Conservatives came to power. But I think in the hands of a wider group encompassing broader social expectations, there is a hope of moving towards a democratic or left MMT. So critics of MMT move from foot to foot saying it's nothing new, it's just Aberlerner's functional finance, we've known that for 70 years, and yet simultaneously the ramifications of implementing MMT are dangerous because a broad people's understanding of the ability of government to mobilise resources could be an emancipatory building block. And of course, the loosening of the revenue constraint might cause inflation. Incidentally, CPI just fell into record deflationary territory of minus 1.9% in the most recent quarter. I should hasten to add that progressive redistributive taxation is highly necessary for a number of social and democratic reasons, not least breaking the money, power, money cycle. Politically, there is discomfort with the implications of how the government is already operating in practice. We on the left should use that cognitive dissonance as a stepping stone, a wedge, and a mandate for greater democratic accountability over the government's role in the economy. We know you can do this, you've shown us as much, so make our well-being appropriately consulted upon the purpose of that mobilisation of resources. In other words, the government using the tool as the economy as a tool to ensure the social good, and in turn society using its knowledge of government as a tool to express its wishes and needs. What would we choose to do with the resources thus mobilised? In the face of the stresses we are experiencing, an economy that serves the social purpose, that does what an economy is supposed to do, would be a caring economy. Care for each other in the context of pandemic and demographic change, care for the land and the planet in the context of climate change. Things that the profit and rent-driven private sector has demonstrated that it does especially poorly. So we need an ambitious, durable commitment to expansionary macroeconomic policy to smooth the transitions we are experiencing and will continue to experience, and to make sure there is enough good, meaningful work to go around as technology and our industry mix evolve. Industry transitions are a normal and healthy feature of any economy. Traditionally, we haven't done them so well in this country. Look what happened to car manufacturing. But that's not to say they can't be done well in a consultative way that involves workers, business, governments, communities. The winding down of the coal mining industry in Germany's Ruhr Valley without a single involuntary job loss is an exemplar, although it's not the only one. Workers who are potentially negatively affected by transitions should enjoy access to government-funded retraining and job placement, work in government enterprises, or generous early retirement. Through our policies and actions, we need to dismantle the narrative that industrial change is intrinsically abnormal and harmful. And technology can be an asset in creating great work. The question of how technology is used is a social and political one, not a fait accompli. It could let us work less, allowing us to pursue more family or leisure time. It could eliminate much tedious or dangerous work. It could help balance our work and production with the overarching need for environmental sustainability. I recently released a research paper, Powering Onwards, on the possibility of revitalising manufacturing using newly installed renewable power and making it a more competitive and larger source of employment in the process. If you are an economic hardhead, you are really arguing uphill against renewables. What various analyses, including my own, show is that the economic and indeed technological argument is over. We're really having a discussion about vested interests, institutions, and culture. So the installation of a green grid and a reinvigorated and expanded Australian manufacturing sector implies a whole lot of high-quality blue-collar jobs that aren't there now. Many of them will use skill sets generalisable from present-day fossil fuel industries, for example, the electrical trades. We definitely need to be a lot smarter than to allow ourselves to be funneled into the false binary, you're pro-coal or you're anti-worker. So let me pose the question once more. Why don't we have a democratic plan for industry and employment? In 1962, in her book Economic Philosophy, Joan Robertson sought to distinguish ideology from science and said that economics was a branch of theology in the sense that mainstream economics is to maintain social control in a similar way that the traditional religious institutions have served. You could say that the COVID crisis caught that economic faith on the hop. Any engineer will tell you that a resilient system is one with redundancy built in. But we had spent a great deal of time and effort removing redundancy from our economy, the cult of efficiency. When we hit the COVID crater, our punitive and exclusionary approach to economic management came into sharp relief. And that sort of economic and social exclusion had been the case under pre-COVID conditions as well. We already had an unemployment crisis. We had a youth unemployment crisis. We had a precarious jobs crisis with around half of workers experiencing at least one dimension of precarity in their work. We had a wage theft crisis. We had a bullshit jobs crisis. We had a crisis of exploitation amongst migrant workers. We had a wage growth crisis, of course. We had a productivity growth crisis. And we had sluggish economic growth, sometimes referred to as a per capita recession. So we didn't enter the pandemic from a position of economic or social strength. Far from it. In that context, or any context, it's meaningless to talk about a jobless recovery. As well as the income conferred by work, there are important things that we need to attend to and should be collectively doing with our time, energy, and creativity. We shouldn't just settle for jobs. We should be demanding good, dignified, pro-social jobs. If the private sector won't pay for them, the public sector should and must. There's no shortage of work that needs to be done in transitioning to an economy that serves us all. Today, 1 in 3 Australians have no access to sick leave. These casual workers are concentrated in low-waged, erratically waged, and often customer-facing roles. Over 1 million aren't eligible for the JobKeeper wage subsidy, having been with their employers for less than a year. Over 1 million migrant workers aren't eligible either, and furthermore can't access our welfare system. The question of what proportion of these workers can actually afford to self-isolate is an open one, but there is now substantial evidence to suggest that many workers can't afford to skip work if they contract the COVID virus. The recent outbreaks in privately run aged care facilities in Victoria are just one horrific example. So workforce precarity doesn't just impact on the living standards and psychological health of employees. By affecting the workforce behaviour of those people, it has knock-on effects on population health as a whole. This includes those workers who aren't in casualised work, families and children, and vulnerable population groups, such as the elderly and those who are immunocompromised. And it's a democratic crisis. No worker chooses to be that vulnerable. The notion that a casual loading, a multiplier on an insultingly low wage, compensates a worker for the absence of formal leave would be laughable if its effects weren't so pernicious. The Centre for Future Work strongly supports the ACTU's proposal, now officially supported by the Business Council of Australia, that the government provide 2 weeks of paid special leave for all workers. The government's latest announcement for 2 weeks of leave in disaster areas at something around the minimum wage is not nearly enough. And it's remarkable that some businesses operating in a competitive environment beat the government to the punch on sick leave for casuals. What does that say about the state of our social fabric, that we are relying on the benevolence of profit-driven businesses to protect our most vulnerable workers? So across the board, I am calling for a living income. Everybody in Australia should have enough money to live a dignified life. When there aren't enough jobs for everybody who wants a job, people should still have an income that allows them the enjoyment of a wealthy, advanced society. I was recently gladdened by a brief Twitter interaction I had with Shock Jock Joe Hildebrand, in which we were in furious agreement on this. There's no reason for anyone not to have enough to live on in Australia, regardless of their employment status. I'm not especially keen to get into the pros and cons of a job guarantee versus a universal basic income. They both seem to me to have advantages and disadvantages. And why not both? But in the conspicuous absence of some sort of large-scale jobs plan or commitment to full employment, what has just happened in practice? A right-wing government has obviously felt sufficiently politically vulnerable as to institute a very temporary, functional UBI. Now they're trying to wind it back, of course, while employment is still going up, mind you. And in order to do so, they need to have a very persuasive and multifaceted message about how the COVID supplement is being abused. That's a new iteration of downwards class envy. Employers can't find workers. Yeah, right. And the government have done everything they can. So what will happen now? Well, we need to combat the vested interests that militate against full employment. What the Commonwealth government is seeking to do now, albeit in an unplanned, fragmented and chaotic way, is to turn the corner towards austerity. The dimensions of that include, and these are all connected, moving workers towards more precarious work with temporary IR changes, the reintroduction of harmful mutual obligations stipulations for the unemployed, expanding the reserve army of the unemployed, including through the incremental discontinuation of JobKeeper, continuation of the ongoing abandonment of full employment as a policy goal, cutting wages and conditions while expanding the profit share, and using the pandemic to privatise essential services. They're also looking for ways to rescue and expand the fossil fuel industry, which, by the way, isn't just ecologically unsustainable, it's also not at all jobs intensive compared to any other industry you care to mention. For a better economy than the one we had before COVID, Australians need to organise and resist this entire agenda. This is because neoliberalism is likewise an organised program. And over the last 4+ decades, we have shifted a great deal of income and wealth in Australia and globally towards the top of the socio-economic distribution. This was not really about shrinking the state, it was about repurposing it. and it has worked to our great collective misfortune. The effects have been not only tangible, they have been cultural as well. It has been fascinating and heartening to see these policies and attitudes unwind in real time. But we should not make the mistake of thinking that COVID represents some sort of final death knell for neoliberalism. The Austerian mindset is already reasserting itself. So to sum up, my message is that the conscious and collective decisions we make as a society will determine the future of work and our economy. We need to grab the political moment and repurpose the state back. We have the potential to produce for ourselves greater societal well-being than our forebears did, or indeed than we presently do, even absent the pandemic. But we've had major problems thinking about distribution across the population at any given moment and across time. That's significantly impinging on our current and future well-being. We must reflect that in order to be genuinely democratic, it's not just today's population that we need to consider, it's everyone's descendants as well as non-human animals and natural environments. And we should understand that we'll be required to make moral and political judgments about incommensurability, features of our natural world that for intrinsic reasons we cannot afford to exploit, no matter the financial gains to be had. We need to collectively distinguish between wealth creation and wealth extraction. To make truly democratic decisions, we need to interpret the value of everything and not just the price of everything. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. That's terrific. I think that was a big picture you were walking us through there, and a very challenging questions to end with. I'd like to just remind the viewers to use the YouTube comments facility to send a question or a comment, which we can then inject into the discussion after Frank's spoken. So let's now welcome Frank Stilwell to take this discussion a step further. Thank you, Frank.
Still on mute, Frank?
You have to unmute, Frank.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak on this important topic. As we all know, of course, we're in a crisis. It's a health crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. And the question of what is to be done is, I think, on everyone's mind. The phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste, is one that we're all familiar with. On the political right, we can see the Morrison government already, even though its first reaction had to be to create stimulus, a defensive set of policies to ensure that unemployment and poverty did not become worse than it actually has. But now, when they're asked this question, what is to be done in a post-COVID recovery process, we're hearing the familiar conservative story. We're hearing about industrial relations reform, which is code for more union bashing. We're hearing about the need to bring forward a regressive set of tax cuts that will advantage the rich, presumably on the assumption of some kind of trickle-down economics that will lead to a more general economic stimulus. This is the old-time religion, and Josh Frydenberg has even recently been engaging in some kind of puerile flirtation with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, long gone and not very well remembered. But apparently, for Freudenberg at least, these are sources of inspiration about what might be done to restructure the economy in a way that will give a renewed surge of jobs and growth. I don't think so, and I'm rather heartened that the political commentariat has been very forthcoming in showing that the lessons to be learned are not from Thatcher and Reagan, but perhaps more so from post-war recovery in Australia, led by the then Labor government, engaging in a process of nation building. And from the Great Depression years, not in Australia so much, but in the United States, where President Franklin Delano Roosevelt engaged in the policies of the New Deal, which brings me to my point of advocacy. If we're asking what is to be done, I think there is a clear package of policies, a way forward that could be embraced by a progressive alternative government replacing the current mob at the next election. And I think for Australian people, our task now is to generate a political movement that will make this clear, popular, and enlivened, driven by popular movement for change. The opportunity is there, and I think if one clarifies what a Green New Deal could now be, we can move forward with confidence and some degree of unity. Well, the phrase New Deal does indeed derive from the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression, when creating jobs was the paramount priority. And indeed, that's the case again now, isn't it? A lot of people have lost their jobs. Some are never gonna get them back, particularly in small businesses that have gone under and won't recover. This is a hard time, and we certainly do need, all of us, I think, to talk about job creation. But alongside with that job creation, there has to be recognition of environmental concerns. This is the progressive twist. We have to, in other words, we have to go beyond a simple Keynesian stimulus. I mean, in fact, the Morrison government's already done that. They've produced the largest budget deficit in Australia's history as a means of defending jobs and hopefully creating some kind of stimulus for their much cherished jobs and growth. Well, that's not enough. Even if it were to work, it needs to be married to an ecological agenda that recognizes the threat of climate change and makes sure that the job growth is in areas which are compatible with the goal of seeking ecologically sustainable economic development from now on. So there are plenty of opportunities, and many analysts have pointed out, in all sorts of fields, in energy production, in waste management, in water infrastructure, in transportation, in building design and retrofitting. There's much work to be done in restructuring our economy so that it will be ecologically sustainable and reduce our contribution to global climate change. This has to be on the agenda of any progressive alternative program. But thirdly, so too does the engagement with inequality. There's an abundance of evidence from practical experience around the world showing that more equal countries do better in so many respects. They do better in educational outcomes. They do better in terms of their environmental policy impacts. They do better in terms of social mobility, social cohesion, lower crime rates, better standards of physical and mental health. We need to be the egalitarian society that Australia's political leaders have so often preached but seldom delivered on. Now is the time to actually do it. If we can, first and foremost, have a just transition, not just a transition to an ecologically sustainable society, but a just transition which ensures that people losing their jobs are re-employed in areas and given the necessary education, training, reskilling for that work. We need to have egalitarian goals also pursued through taxation reform, so that the wealthy who've been getting an increased concentration of our national resources pay a larger share of the taxation. And we do need, at the bottom end, to ensure there's a better cushion, whether it comes through job guarantee or through a universal basic income. And I agree with Dan that I think the pros and cons of those alternatives are less important than embracing the commitment that that's the road down which we want to go. And indeed, some combination of job guarantees and universal basic income are feasible in the Australian context and will certainly be necessary in the years ahead. So if we can bring those elements together, the job retraining process, the tax reform process, and the anti-poverty programs that come with improving this social safety net, then we are on the road at last to possibly moving in a more egalitarian direction. So those are three elements: the job focus, the environmental focus, the equity focus. But alongside those, there are some other elements that also need to be considered. The equity focus, I think, also needs to be broadened into a politics of recognition as well as a politics of redistribution. And specifically, I mean here, the recognition of Indigenous people and the link between a Green New Deal, therefore, with First Nations people's interests. I mean, when you think about the First Nations people of Australia living in this continent sustainably for over 60,000 years, their sustainability credentials are second to none on this whole planet. And we have much to learn, I think, from giving Australian people, the Indigenous people, a voice, learning from them about questions of sustainability, about the development of cooperative processes of organisation that will be more productive and indeed more sustainable than the traditional capitalist models, and also about the management of the commons. These are all crucial areas where the ecological, the economic and the social justice elements come together. And then, of course, there's the trade issues. This is a matter on which advocates of a Green New Deal sometimes differ, but I take the view that we could, within a Green New Deal, embrace more emphasis on local production for local consumption. That could help in this process of revitalising Australian manufacturing industry. It could also help to reduce the ecological footprint of economic activity by making less demands on transportation processes internationally. Now, that's not to say that Green New Deal can't involve international trade. Yes, it could and should, but I think an emphasis on where possible, local production for local consumption could be part of this strategy. Finally, let me say a word or two about the politics of it all. A Green New Deal has to involve some bottom-up elements as well as a top-down policy process. Indeed, it will only come to fruition through a process of popular grassroots struggle. And I think, therefore, it may be in some respects better to think in terms of Green New Deals involving regional forums where people get together across the nation to talk about how the resources of their region could be best used to meet the needs of the people in those localities. But workplaces too could be enlivened through discussions about how people working in particular occupations, in particular industries, would see themselves contributing towards a more nationwide Green New Deal. So what I have in mind here, and it's by no means a unique thought, is a marriage of a bottom-up process of popular participation, struggle, engagement, with the necessary top-down element that involves policies driven by a new government. Then this brings us to the question of political parties. Who's going to do this? Well, the Greens are already strongly on board, as you would expect. They officially embraced the idea of a Green New Deal late last year, before the COVID crisis began. But of course, it's the Labour Party that is where the buck stops. If the Labour Party won't embrace a program like this, there's going to be no alternative government capable of making the necessary policy changes. I haven't given up hope about that. I mean, the Labour Party is deliberating on its future policies, but there are clearly two stumbling blocks. One is that there's a strong pro-coal faction within the Labour Party, led by MPs such as Joel Fitzgibbon in the Hunter region, who are going to be very reluctant to embrace any Green New Deal that looks anti-mining. And so that commitment to an extractivist industry is going to, I think, bedevil Labour's internal deliberations about embracing a Green New Deal. But the other element, of course, that simply because the Greens have already advocated this, the Labour Party will be reluctant to associate itself with anything that looks like it's borrowed from the Greens. These parties are in electoral competition, and many people in the Labour Party are very toey about doing anything that seems to be cozying up to the Greens. But I don't worry too much about that, because ultimately it's the contents of the policy, not the label, that matters. And if Labour, to embrace a Green New Deal, want to relabel it in some other way, well, that's just fine. And one lives in hope that they will do just that, because frankly, they need some kind of inspiring alternative to the policies of the current Morrison government, if they're going to stand a chance of victory at the next election. And at that next election, the lingering effects of the COVID crisis will still be with us. And I hope that we now have the opportunity to create a real turning point in Australian society.
Thank you very, very much, Frank. You've put some hard questions out to people, and I think some very clear policy lines. So now we're going to try our Q&A time to see what ideas we all have about this huge global event we're taking part in here in Sydney and Australia. But I'm looking for any questions that you might have put into the comments section of YouTube. So I haven't seen any yet. I thought this might happen, and I made some questions up. So we'll see how we go. But please, don't be shy. It's just a different process, just to type some words into that field. Okay, so I got up a few questions, but I think I'll start at the last one I had, because I think what Frank said there about inequality and inclusion, if you start thinking about Australia's First Nations and the pandemic, I still think we're a long way from, any government-led to happen, for instance, with no more money. So roughly, in fact, $500 million less than it had in 2014. So, it's a shocking sort of charade. But can I just ask either Dan or Frank if they'd like to comment on how does this social crisis with the pandemic impact on equality for Australia's First Nations?
Shall I have a go?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Sure. I think we're at this political moment where essentially our resources, our endowment, if you like, our common wealth, could go one of two ways. It could be directed in a more equitable way, or we could lose that battle, and it could be shifted upwards in that more Austerian way. And I guess when I think about the most vulnerable populations, materially speaking, in Australia, of course, we have to consider that our First Nations people are materially disadvantaged in a whole range of different respects, and as such, they're likely to feel a particular bite if the progressive side loses this battle that's upon us. I'm aware that I'm putting it in simplistic and sort of Manichaean terms, but nonetheless, I think it comes back to our conception of the economy. And if we're serious that the economy is about taking care of people, then then the well-being and thriving of our First Nations people needs to be first and foremost when we make resourcing decisions as we come through this crisis.
Yeah, I'd add to that also that I think there's a sort of a limited amount of what you might call political capital that governments have. And at a time of the COVID crisis, you know, the concerns with closing the gap for First Nations people takes a pretty low place on the political agenda. That's why I think a Green New Deal could be a game changer in this, as in many other respects, in saying, well, look, it's not if we do this, then we can't do that, or if we invest all our political capital in job growth, then we can't really do anything fundamental on Indigenous issues. Well, no, I think if we think in terms of a Green New Deal, we can set up processes in which Indigenous people's demand for a voice become part of the development of the new policy program. It's a little bit of sort of idealism, but there's got to be some kind of circuit breaker, because otherwise, how many more inquiries, how many more sets of policy recommendations are we going to have to live through with nothing much otherwise happening on the ground?
I think that's right, Frank, and I think if you conceptualize part of the Green New Deal is about, democratizing economic participation, then that question of Indigenous self-determination kind of throws itself into relief.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I got a question from Kathy. This is a more global one. We learned from an ABC reportage on Sweden that having prioritized the economy and not locked down in the interests of public health, they lost on both compared to other Scandinavian countries who subsequently closed their borders to Sweden. We learned recently that 26 million people in COVID-ridden USA are about to be evicted and will be hard to isolate after that. Does this mean that the need for economic equality is urgent, more urgent? That's the question.
Yes, I'll try to answer that. Certainly, I'm no expert about Sweden. I've often written about equality, and Sweden is an exemplar, actually, for many of the countries of the rest of the world about how you can actually have a highly progressive taxation system, good social safety net, good social services, a cohesive society, while also having good material living standards overall. But I think they rather blew it on this issue in dealing with the COVID crisis. From what I've read, the policy has been bad for health and bad for the economy too. And that, I think, is a pertinent lesson. There is no trade-off here. If you can't have a good health outcomes, you're not likely to have good economic outcomes. It's a simple lesson, and I think unfortunately in this instance, Sweden has given us the negative example. Australia can do better. New Zealand is already doing better. Frankly, I mean, here's the real exemplar just across the ditch from us. They've managed effectively to get through this crisis, at least so far, with good health outcomes and still a working economy. We don't have to look far for good exemplars.
Okay. I'll go to the next one then. There's a question from Chandran. How confident are you that a Labor government would have the gumption and passion to implement your ideas? Their past record makes me hesitate a bit. Okay. Repeat.
Maybe I'll have a stab at this too, because I've explicitly argued that a way forward must involve some progressive role for the ALP. I think, although I hesitate to do this, I want to draw a parallel with the 1980s and the Accord. The Accord was, for all its limitations and in some respects unfortunate consequences, it was a game changer. In the early 1980s, there was a major recession. Something had to be done, and the Hawke government, armed with the Accord, came along with an alternative on offer. And it involved participation with the labour movement, the organised labour. It involved a cooperative approach to economic management. Some would say papering over the class conflict that's inherent in a capitalist economy, but trying to develop policies that would create jobs, produce equitable outcomes, and a better public sector, improved social wages, it was then called, and so forth. Now, things got a bit derailed down the track, but as a game changer, it had the potential to be a really progressive shift in Australian politics. And I think a Green New Deal could do something like that today. So why wouldn't a Labour Party embrace it, appropriately relabelled and adapted to the interests? But the opportunity is there. If they don't grasp something like that, then their chances of just coasting in because they're an alternative to the Morrison government are not good. They're not good. The Morrison government could be re-elected. Morrison's own popularity is riding reasonably high at the moment. And there's no great groundswell of blaming, as there is in Victoria, I believe, no groundswell of blaming the government nationally for the management of the COVID crisis. Yes, there are grumbles, but that's not going to be enough to get Labor into office. A Green New Deal could.
Okay. Dan, would you like to comment on that question at all? I've got a few more to come, so there's no shortage at the moment.
Sure. I mean, I think I'll measure my words.
Okay.
But I would say that I think Frank's right, that obviously any alternative government needs to present an alternative vision of society and the economy. And I think this is an inflection point in our economic history. And either Labor needs to pick up that mantle or it'll just kind of be carried in some other direction by someone else. So, really it's, the ball's in their court.
Okay. All right. The next question comes from Michael. What are the prospects of a grassroots-based Green New Deal rather than one steered via a Labor-right electoralism? And then he adds, I will preface this by observing how many COVID-19 measures have been adopted by state and federal governments through both community panic and political action. It's a little bit harder to grasp that, but anyway, grassroots versus top-down again, like Frank prefaced in his talks.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point that Frank made, and it's not really one that I had kind of considered. I had contrasted the two in I think a probably more black and white way. But Frank's right, of course, as he oftentimes is. There does need to be a level of planning and coordination that does happen from the top, but it also needs to be sort of built, have a consultative process built into it, and so. Rather than being a planned process in an exclusive sense, it needs to be a consultative process where there's flows of information and decision making going in and out of the central hub of government, if you want to conceptualize it that way.
Okay, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, the Labour Party isn't a monolithic organisation anyway. Sometimes you get that impression when you see the party's leaders on TV just restating the party line over and over again. But if you think historically, there's always been sort of internal factions, internal points of view, people pushing on the boundaries of what is the current thinking. I'd like to see that revived, and I think it would only be revived if there was a stronger grassroots movement and local activism struggle saying, come on, Labour, get on board. Even though there are sort of pro-coal and conservative elements within the party, the internal party divisions, look, no one likes making internal party divisions public these days, but it's a healthy feature. And you'd like to see that happening. There's a little window of opportunity right now. If they leave it too close to the next election, they won't, because they have to close ranks and join into a united front. Now is the time.
And there are certainly progressive voices within Labor as well, as I'm sure all of your audience is aware.
Okay, I've got another question now. This is from Stephen. What do the wonderful speakers think of Howard Zinn's words? Voting is easy, but a poor substitute for democracy, which requires direct action by concerted citizens. How to get there? Okay, good luck.
Yeah, look, I think that's, I completely agree with that quote and kind of alluded to a similar idea close to the start of my talk. I think that, membership of organizations that represent workers' interests or represent community interests is really important, because you can believe that the top end of town have organizations that they belong to that represent their interests. And, those organizations aren't entirely unified. There are people in the Minerals Council who are uncomfortable with things that the Minerals Council says and does, but they realize that their interests are more effectively advocated for by being part of that organization than not. And so I think that's a good lesson for us on the left to learn as well. And I understand that if you're sort of critical persuasion, it can be hard to involve yourself in an organization that you're not 100% behind, and sometimes things do turn into kind of internecine sniping. But nonetheless, I think there's an incredible amount of joint work that we need to do together, despite differences, where we can identify common ground through the union movement, through grassroots movements to get rid of particularly reactionary elements in Parliament. So I'm thinking, for example, of independents that have been elected in certain electorates at the federal level, and through community movements more generally. Extinction Rebellion is, I think, a good example of a movement that where not everyone shares everything in common, but nonetheless they sure make an impression, notwithstanding their differences.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Frank?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I think we're in an era where social movements are just as important as conventional political parties. I mean, you mentioned Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter is another social movement that's got tremendous energy at the moment. And even though direct policy changes don't necessarily follow from social movement pressure, it can shift the center of gravity, change the climate of opinion. Otherwise, frankly, fellow members of the Politics in the Pub process, we're just wasting our time, because if we're just waiting for sort of top-down policies to filter through the organization of political parties, we're waiting for Godot. So look, I love politics. I've spoken of it many times, but and the underlying assumption underpinning everything we do is that ideas and energy from people matter, even if they don't directly have impact on government policies or even party programs. It's part of the process of a healthy society trying to drive social change. So for Politics in the Pub, look, you might as well just go to the pub, if and when you can, and drink. But we're not doing that. We're trying to discuss how we can actually get a better society.
Okay. I've got a comment and a question from Andrew Mack. He says, terrific use of the medium, both excellent speakers and positive potentials. Regarding the need to pay the bills for all of this terrific policy, should we be talking about modern monetary theory and how to get it? So there you go. Who's first?
Yeah,
Go, Dan.
I'd be happy to have a go. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really useful lens through which to view the economy. I don't think it's everything. I would consider myself, sympathetic to modern monetary theory, but I wouldn't say that I'm an MMT sort of acolyte or zealot. And I'm certainly aware that those people are out there. The reason I think it's useful, and I think, again, I sort of alluded to this, is that it just drops some blinkers from our thinking in terms of the resources that the government can mobilise. So as such, I think once some of those artificial constraints are dropped, not only do we see some possibilities that maybe we didn't see before, some broader political horizons or policy horizons, but also we see what the government's already been doing and basically the way in which they have been mobilising resources for the benefit of their donors and so on. I mean, to me, it's not really something you implement. It's just it's something that helps us see what's going on in the macro economy. And there's a whole lot of other work that needs to be done around that that's not MMT, but is equally important and useful.
Okay, Frank, what do you think?
I've been somewhat of a skeptic about so-called modern monetary theory. I suppose reflecting my own background with a better grounding in Keynesian economics, but there are elements evidently of convergence. Modern monetary theory says that there's no fiscal constraint on governments engaging in expansionary policies. So if we want more expenditure on job creation programs, on improved infrastructure, just do it, because that process of economic expansion is not constrained in the same way in which a household is constrained by its past savings or what it's got in the cookie jar or on the kitchen shelf. Expansion need not be constrained by those conventional budgetary concerns. Now, I think that's a great lesson. And it's an element in which I think modern monetary theory has in common with a Keynesian perspective. And as someone said to me the other day, look, modern monetary theory isn't really a theory, it's an explanation of what bankers do. And so we may as well embrace that and see if we can give it a progressive potential. And at the moment, and I put that phrase in very carefully, at the moment, the conditions seem propitious. We don't have inflation. The official rates of interest are at a very low level. The emphasis has to be on fiscal policy, not monetary policy, in order to create the conditions for economic expansion. And modern monetary theory rides those circumstances perfectly. Now, that's not to say that it's always the way to go. In other circumstances where you've got inflationary tendencies, you wouldn't want to go down that road of a massive expansion of government expenditure. But right now you can do it. There's spare resources, there's no inflationary problem, interest rates are at rock bottom, reconfirmed today by the Reserve Bank of Australia at an official cash rate of 0.25%. How low can you go? This is the moment, ladies and gentlemen. It's free money. Governments can simply expand the economy without a major problem of interest on debt.
Okay, thank you very much on that. I've got one other question, which is more on the social dimension again, from Stephen again. So he starts, Australia is torturing refugees. Both parties, that's the Coalition and Labor, seem to think this is a vote winner. What purpose does this play in the economy? How can we stop this abomination?
Well, let me just say right at the outset, in the context of the conversation we've just had and the speeches that Dan and I have made, it's just a complete sideshow. It's doing nothing to help create that more egalitarian and decent society. Rather, it's just hitting that old button about appealing to the worst interests of a divided society. Now, I know in phrasing tonight's topic around the question of democracy, the organisers of Politics in the Pub had in mind Donald Trump and other authoritarian figures. Well, this is their agenda. They want to build a bloody wall, put refugees on Pacific Islands. This is the stuff appealing to the most base instincts of xenophobia, racism. It has no place in any discussions about building a better society.
Okay. Any comment from you, Dan? Or we...
Yeah, look, I think all of that is correct. And I guess I just say that when that sort of stuff is going on, it gives you a clue that something is being hidden from you, or there's something else they don't want you paying attention to. And in that case, I think it's basically been the grift of our economy for the benefit of a small coterie of capitalists and rentiers. And we've been sort of distracted with these sorts of a particularly dark and pernicious form of identity politics, I think.
Yeah. Okay. We're getting close to the end, I think, but I'd like to put this question to you. Are either of you aware of any sector apart from the trade unions who have put forward a plan for recovery? For instance, has the Business Council done it? Are you aware of the Labor Party, the Coalition yet? And we got the Green New Deal project from the Greens. So apart from that, is there any other voices in this conversation?
Well, the NCCC's out there.
We just don't know what they're doing.
Well, they've got the gas-fired recovery sort of angle on it. And they're saying extremely strange things. For example, renewables are already doing so well that gas needs to be subsidized in order to compete with the renewables industry, which is just, on this amazing trajectory. get behind gas, everybody. In terms of sort of a persuasive policy manifesto, I think the ACTU's 5 points for change that came out the other week, or maybe a week ago.
Just 1 week ago, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely an important document.
Okay, Frank, any other information out there?
Well, I guess that the major alternative is, as always, just stumbling through, and that's what the Morrison government is offering. They flirt with Thatcherite rhetoric, but in practice they implement Keynesian policies. They're running the biggest budget deficit in Australian history, notwithstanding their previous concerns about debt and deficit. Presumably the debt truck is parked somewhere around in the Simpson Desert, busting away at the moment. This is the moment when the orthodoxy has sort of such a pragmatic and short-term and defensive character that there's a wonderful opportunity for a real progressive agenda to get up. As I said in my earlier remarks, the phrase "never let a good crisis go to waste" has been associated with the political right, but here's the opportunity for the political left to act on that principle.
Okay, on that point, we've got one last question. Can we move radically close to close the gender wage gap now by valuing upwards the work of women in retail, cleaning, hospitality, education and health? We're talking about a huge thing here. But now, as you say,
a Green New Deal to have wage equity by gender, by ethnicity. This is, it seems to me axiomatic that it should be part of such a program. Quite how to do it obviously needs careful consideration, but no one can doubt in the context of the COVID crisis that women's work matters. And it certainly in those areas where often women are dominant in health, in education, in caring, in aged people's homes and so forth. These are the crunch jobs where we really need to value women's work alongside men's work interchangeably.
Okay, Dan, any comment?
Yeah. Look, I think that's right. Early in the start of, it's close to the start of my speech, I used the expression foundational economy, and I think that a lot. Well, really, what the COVID crisis has shown us is what we actually rely on in the economy, and a huge amount of it is women's work, or traditionally has been. It's either been uncompensated or poorly compensated. We know that women have suffered the economic effects of the COVID crisis particularly badly. There were more women in casual employment to begin with, but also even if you just look at casual employees, even if you just look at the cohort of casuals, women have been, selectively retrenched at a greater rate than men have. We got a long way to go, and I think I'll quote our chief economist again because he's excellent with the metaphors. He says, when the tide goes out, you see where the rocks are, and I think gender equity, when labour market conditions are better, it's less obvious that gender equity is a problem. Still obvious, but things have become a lot nastier now, and I think we really need to look to what our response has been under conditions of crisis, and build that into any policy response.
Okay. Well, I think I've come really to the end of the questions, and perhaps if either of you want to say something else that, you know, struck you in the conversation, now's the moment. Is there anything like that you'd like to say? Yes or no? Okay. I'd like to thank you both very, very much. I can't do the applause, and the people out there can't communicate it to you, but I think we've done well. We've got over 50 people watching live, and I do think we will have many more viewers as a result of this. And it's such an important conversation to push hard for. So thank you both very much. The topic for Tuesday, August 18 is similar in a way, the end of global capitalism ? And the speakers are Phil Glendenning, who's the director of the Edmund Rice Centre, and Stuart Rees, who's an emeritus professor also from the University of Sydney. But I think possibly the entry points there will be more moral and philosophical, social than the economic starting point tonight. So I hope people can just put that in the diary. It's likely to be in person at the Hotel Harry in Surrey Hills, but stay posted for any change due to the pandemic, because I'm afraid I've got that feeling. But let's hope we can have the event face to face, which we can again record and broadcast as well. So if you want to look at any tonight's program, tell your friends about it. They can go to the politicsinthepub.org.au website and the YouTube channel associated with Politics in the Pub. The link is there. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Frank and Dan. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Kathy for the technicals, and all of those of you who've joined us tonight. We'll see each other again live or some other way